So in order to make a neuroplastic changes in your brain, you have to go just at the edge of where your comfort zone ends.
Exactly. Well put. And so let's say if going out of your comfort zone actually increases your comfort zone. So if you stay in
Yeah.
your comfort zone, you'll actually shrink your comfort zone.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Being Yourself show, where world's renowned thought leaders and best-selling authors share their wisdom and insight with you so that you can achieve your goals and be more productive and a better version of yourself. If you're new to this channel, you may consider subscribing for your regular dose of wisdom and inspiration. My name is Ajay Mathur, and my guest today is a globally sought-after speaker, an award-winning author, a psychologist who has written over 16 books on how one can make most of their brains and its abilities. He has taught seminars in all over US, all 50 states, plus 26 countries outside of US. He has over 40 years of experience providing psychological services and directing mental health programs. His new book, Rewire Your Brain 2.0, which is coming soon, but what I have read is the old one, which is version 1, which is an amazing read, which we will be talking a lot about. And we'll also ask him why did he has to write another version 2 of the same book. So let's welcome Dr. John Arden, the author of 16 books. John, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate the invitation and wonderful to talk to you today.
Thank you. So let's start with finding out, like you've gone really deep in the brain, right? You've done your studies in the brain science, and then you've written so many books. I would like to know what's your inspiration to get into this field of subject.
Well, as you noted, I've been in the mental health field for about 4 decades, and it's always been my feeling that a lot of the science is not communicated to the general public in a down-to-earth way, so we can make use of it to make it practical, so to speak. So, in many ways, I kind of view myself as one of the, and there are many, one of the translators of the science. So, I'm not exactly a researcher. In other words, I don't do research on the brain, but I actually look at the research. So I'm reading studies and then try to make it understandable in a practical way for the general public so they can make better sense of it. And also, as you said, be a better you, so to speak. In other words, use your full potential and not get caught up in repetitive patterns of depression and anxiety and so on.
Hmm. Okay, so I've only got a chance to read your one book, and in that, the Rewire Brain, you delve into neuropsychological and neurobiological aspects of mental health. And what do you believe are the most important things for individuals to understand about their own brain and mental health?
Well, first of all, think of ourselves as incredibly adaptive creatures. We are probably one of the most adaptive creatures on the planet. And so, unfortunately, many people in popular culture assume that their DNA is their destiny. They have a broken brain and they can't do anything about it. They have some bad genes or something like that. The fact of the matter is, we're so much more pliable. So initially, when I wrote that book that you noted, roughly about 13 years ago,
Mhm.
I thought that what we really need to do is communicate to our clients about the pliability, the flexibility of the brain. In other words, to learn new skills, you're changing your brain. We call it neuroplasticity. I just call it rewire your brain. But we also see that genes aren't destiny either, like I was noting. In fact, you can turn on and off your genes by your behavior. I don't mean all your genes, but basically your lifestyle has a major effect on what genes are expressed and what genes are not expressed.
And in the book, I think is in the book or somewhere in your one of the interviews, I heard that your DNA only has like 20% of gene. What exactly was that?
Well, there was a massive international study roughly about 20 years ago called the
Mhm.
Human Genome Project.
Yeah.
And researchers from all over the world try to map out the human genome. And they discovered that we didn't have as many genes as we once assumed that we had. We thought we had perhaps maybe 100,000 genes. Turns out that we have roughly about 24, 22,000 genes. And the shock, of course, was that there are other creatures with the same number of genes. For example, a worm has roughly the same number of genes. So if you're operating with this silly idea that your genes are destiny, when you're walking around on the grass and worms are crawling around underneath, do you think they're going to psychiatrists to get Prozac for depression or something? Like there's that kind of correspondence. Well, actually, that's a silly idea that geneticists call genetic astrology. Genes don't do that. Genes essentially rather, they're recipes for amino acids that get combined together to make proteins. That's all genes do, and they don't do it by themselves. Now, the other thing that I think you were noting was that, well, if we have roughly, let's say, 24,000 genes, how much of our DNA are genes? 2%. So 2% of our DNA are recipes for proteins, essentially, right? That means 98% aren't genes. Okay, so what is it? What is that 98%? Well, at one point, because researchers didn't understand what it was called junk DNA. Turns out that it's not junk at all. It's non-coding DNA. In other words, it's DNA that actually participates in gene expression based on what we do, our behavior. So, getting back to the worm, we're far more adaptable than worms are. Their DNA are almost primarily genes. We have this 98% of non-coding DNA. Now, what's different about the book that you mentioned, The Rewire Your Brain, that came out in 2010, I didn't describe any of this. Because it really wasn't readily available. We were just trying to understand it at that point. So now, roughly 13 years later, I wanted to include this in an easy to digest general culture book, including, by the way, and we'll get into this as well, a discussion about your immune system and also your metabolism.
Okay, so we'll look when the new book comes, and definitely I will order it and read it, and we'll maybe have another interview to talk about that book. But from the current book, I found quite a lot of interesting information about how one can use their time more effectively. You have written about snap judgments, and you've written about memory, different kind of memory. So let's pick up those kind of ideas from the book. And one thing I really found very interesting and new for me, I just thought that there is only short-term memory and long-term memory, and that's it. But in your book, I came across so many different types of memories. You have working memory, you have implicit, explicit, lots of it. Can you give us a little bit of details about what kind of different classifications of memories that exist and how they're different neurologically, and how one can use your tips and tricks to enhance those?
Sure, sure. Think of memory as the fabric of who you are. Memory is, in the broad sense, your experience in life that you can use essentially to predict the future so you don't make the same mistakes that you made before. Um, if all your memory systems, and you were describing a few, and I'll get into some detail in a few minutes, if all your memory systems are working together, then you can more easily and practically predict the future so you don't end up making the same mistakes again. So let's take a look at what some of these memory systems are. You mentioned implicit and explicit memory. So these are broad categories of long-term memory. Long-term memory meaning essentially memories that you can have over a lifetime. So you've accumulated a lot of experiences, and there are different ways that these memories are encoded in your brain by various, let's call them neurological structures, or really they're networks in the brain. So implicit memory, sometimes called non-declarative memory, meaning when you have an implicit memory, you don't say, oh, hey, John, what was that implicit memory about this feeling that I had when I'm in this kind of environment? They're non-declarative, meaning they just happen in a non-conscious way. They just come up, right? And the implicit memories, the non-declarative memories, are actually much larger than the declarative memories. So the declarative memories are more like the memory of our conversation. Like next week, when we think back at this nice conversation that you and I had, that's an episodic memory. It's an episode in our lives. We might remember some details about what we talked about. You know, there's some semantic quality, in other words, language and so on. Those are memories that you can declare. In other words, you bring up and you say, oh, John, yeah, that's right. I remember that wonderful conversation that we had. In fact, before we went on air, we were talking about India, and I was learning a lot about India from you. And those are details, right? That's declarative memory. So declarative memory is often thought to be what most memories are about, but the non-declarative memory is vast. So let's go back to the non-declarative memory a little bit here. So when you're typing, so you and I were communicating via email before we started talking on Zoom, right? And you were typing, words. That's declarative memory because you remember, oh, yeah, there's John out there. I'm going to communicate to John and set up an interview and all that kind of stuff. But you're also typing, but you're not looking for the B. You're not looking for the J. You're just typing because this repetitive skill that you might have is non-conscious. So
Mhm.
once you learn something like riding a bicycle, driving a car, typing, these are called procedural memories. These are like motoric, meaning muscle. Some people say muscle memory,
Muscle
but
memory.
that's
Yeah.
really not the case. But that's non-conscious. You don't say, "Oh, where's the B? Where's the C?" You already learned how to do that. That's non-conscious. Think of how much of a demand on our brain it would be if we had to remember every time we type where the B and the C was and everything else. We do so much without thinking about it non-consciously. That's memory too. And also reaction patterns. In other words, you and I grew up different towns, different family environments. We responded to our family members, or certainly our parents and grandparents in different sort of ways. And if we enjoyed, let's say, really wonderful nurturance without any abuse and neglect and all that, we absorb in a non-conscious way in our implicit memory system how to be with another person without being anxious.
Mhm.
That's a memory, right? It's not a memory that is like what we were talking about before, like an episode. We say, hey, that happened and this happened. It's more like a reaction to human beings. So what we know is that people who have, let's say, enjoyed early, nice, nurturing, loving relationships can later go on more easily and have those kinds of relationships later on. Doesn't mean the people that haven't aren't capable of it, but sometimes they had to go through a new learning experience. They don't necessarily have to see somebody like me, a psychologist, psychiatrist, some kind of therapist or whatever. They can learn by going through challenging periods.
Mhm.
Now, getting back to the two different types of memory again, meaning the two different categories of long term memory, if they are not working together, they can then cause you some problems. So let me wrap this up by describing what happens with trauma. So I'm in regular communication with friends in the Ukraine, and as the Russians are creating a major trauma for the entire country. Many people have gone through just horrific things, and so if I somehow get out of, let's say, eastern Ukraine, the Donbass area, and move out to Lviv, um, and I hear a motorcycle backfire, I can just immediately react to that motorcycle backfire as if I feel gunfire instead of a motorcycle backfiring. In other words, I don't say to myself, oh, that's a motorcycle right away. It happens so quickly that my memory, again, this is an emotional memory that's encoded uh, through my auditory process, creates an immediate reaction. Safety. I need safety. But I don't say that until later. I react like I need safety. And some people have these kinds of flashbacks if they've been traumatized before. So, as you can see, these kinds of memories can work uh, in conflict with one another. And recovery from that kind of trauma is being able to tolerate non dangerous kinds of sensory experiences like a motorcycle backfiring and so on. So you can see how these things, these types of memories work together and sometimes they don't work together.
So in the all the learnings are one type, and all the recall of events is another type.
Well, actually, all the learnings are many, many types because we're so complex. Because you and I are now doing a Zoom instead of on a telephone, right? So we're looking at one another's eyes and our facial expressions and all that. And we're also using words. We're encoding our experience with one another, not only by the words that we're using, but also the facial expressions. So I'm noting, for example, you're not looking straight in my eyes because you're periodically looking at where the camera is and the camera really reflects it and so on. So there's multiple layers of input, so to speak. So you can say if there's multiple layers of input, there are multiple layers of memory. And then we respond based on prior experiences, which is the implicit, so to speak. But you notice I was moving my hands a little bit. Well, some people don't because they maybe grew up in an environment that you don't do that. And I'm sort of more of a southern Mediterranean type person, despite the fact that growing up in California, you know, I do that more than maybe somebody in a different environment. And then you might respond to my hand movements in a different sort of way.
So how one can improve their memory based, I mean, not the bad sort of memories, but something that is worth something that is memorable or worth remembering, right? Or any information. There is so much of information out there and you need some of it. You just can't rely on Google for everything, right? So everybody wants to have some good memory. So anything that you can suggest how one can, first of all, identify what things to be remembered and what not, and then how to do it best.
Sure. And so, in some ways, you were asking, how can I, or the listener, improve their explicit memory for learning? And
Hmm.
when I say explicit memory, I'm thinking in terms of information that they can use later on. But we also want to make reference to, again, the fact that there are multiple layers of memory. So, one thing we really want to do is get emotionally involved and motivated to learn what we want to learn. In other words, if you're not interested and if you're only doing it because you need to pass an exam, it's really hard to do it because you're not harnessing all the capabilities that you might have. So in your earlier email, you were asking me, how can a person um, enjoy and excel at work and um, harness their memory systems in a positive sort of way? Well, I think curiosity and a sense of purpose harnesses these emotional capabilities that we have, because you really have to harness your feelings about what you're going to be learning. Let's say, for example, you're in the business community and you want to, expand your business in a certain way, but you really have to be involved and motivated to express your enthusiasm for your particular product. What if you're not? You're just a salesman and you're just pretending, and it just happens to be what you're selling right now. Well, people are going to feel that because you're not exuding that kind of enthusiasm, nor are you harnessing all the capabilities that you have to get that across and even learn more about the product. So you see what I'm talking about is really the marriage between all these different types of memory, as well as going ahead and not only learning more about your product, but also sharing what you learned.
Is that why people who lose motivation, either because of some illness like mental health related issue or just generally, right? Nobody's motivated all the time anyway, right? That
Right.
impacts on your ability to hold information, correct?
I really think that uh, when a person's depressed, it's really hard to kind of get enthusiastic about getting outside their own, let's say, dysphoric feelings. However, on the therapeutic side, if they can do that, it's a way of leveraging themselves out of the hole that they feel like they're in. Now let's go back to, let's say a war situation. Let's say Ukraine, and I've spent some time in the Middle East helping the aid workers of the Syrian refugees, and actually previously the Afghans. And when you go through some really, really terrible, horrific kinds of experiences, it's hard to feel positive about things. Um, but if you can feel a sense of purpose, like I know that there are, and I'm in regular communication with some psychologists and some psychiatrists in Ukraine that are involved in the relief. Well, their sense of purpose helps them deal with their own trauma about what is going on to all their fellow Ukrainians and family members and so on. So a sense of purpose harnesses this emotional aspect as well. I'm not just a victim. I'm going to do something about what happened to us so that things can get better. You see how motivation has a lot to do with this implicit memory system that you can change and rewire over time. So let me use actually my family environment. So I'm an Armenian, and part of being an Armenian is having generations of memory related to the genocide that we experienced, because I'm in America because of the genocide, for example. Well, a lot of my family members harness their motivation to create a whole new life by being, doctors and lawyers and so on and so forth, making something of their new existence instead of just sitting there feeling like a victim. Well, yes, they were victims, but they did something about it, and they were able to change their brain, you could say, by harnessing curiosity, motivation, and a sense of purpose.
And also, I think that brings us to the topic of neuroplasticity. So, because of your motivation and everything, you had that drive to make some changes and you were able to make changes. And in the book, you also write that there is a slight anxiety is helpful when you are trying to achieve some neuroplasticity related changes in your brain. but you shouldn't be more anxious than the slight anxiety, right?
Very, very good point. So let's describe what you just said. A slight amount of anxiety is actually a good thing.
Hmm.
So roughly about 100 years ago, there are these two psychologists, Xerxes and Doxin, that came up with this concept that we call the inverted U, which is kind of like, if you can imagine, a bell curve. And so if you're super, super relaxed and you're just kind of sitting there and everything, and you expect to be learning something, you're really not going to learn much. But if you're in the middle of a panic attack on the other end of the bell curve, when it goes way down, you're not going to learn much as
Either.
well, other than just having another panic attack. But if you're a little agitated, if you're a little, let's say, nervous, more of you are activated. That your neurotransmitters, these brain chemicals that neurons communicate with one another, are more activated, making more connections between the neurons, and you can remember more. So we know that uh, the memory of an event that was slightly anxious is better, more durable than a memory of something that is like a usual experience that you have every day. Why? Because more of you are activated. So a slight amount of anxiety is actually a good thing, because you're leaning into the experience.
It's like going out of your comfort zone, right? So inside your comfort zone, you're not anxious at all. But when you just go out marginally, then you have that slight anxiety versus you go like extremely away from your comfort zone. You don't want to go there, right? So in order to make a neuroplastic changes in your brain, you have to go just at the edge of where your comfort zone ends.
Exactly. Well put. And so let's say if going out of your comfort zone actually increases your comfort zone. So if you stay in
Ah,
your comfort zone, you'll actually shrink your comfort zone.
yeah.
And that's what happens with anxiety. So if you only do things you're comfortable with, you're going to end up shrinking down to littler and smaller areas that you're comfortable with. So if you're always pushing your comfort zone, not totally into, like, for example, I'm not going to go to Kabul, Afghanistan right now. The place is crazy. However, some decades ago, that was an okay place to go, right? Or let's say Damascus or the Donbass or whatever. However, going to Western Ukraine, yeah, that's I'm a little out of my comfort zone, but I've been there before, and blah 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 blah. So going moderately out of your comfort zone is where you learn.
Comfort zone is one of the most dangerous place to be, I think.
That's a really good point.
And that's because when you are comfortable, you don't take decisions which are needed in order for you to grow and see something different beyond your current capabilities. And we waste a lot of time in our comfort zone by doing things which don't add any value, like watching TV, or for example, we waste time in just deciding things,
Yeah.
sitting on Amazon.com and thinking of whether to buy this or that, right? Or going in the supermarket, spending time about thinking and thinking, but not deciding. And you actually talk about this subject, so let's talk about this. There's something called spindle cells, which help you making snap judgment. And I personally think that decision making is one of those things that differentiate people from being very good leader or whatever they are versus the rest of the world. So,
Right.
how can we be better at making snap judgments, or rather, how to improve our decision making?
Well, let's take, for example, first
Mm.
the whole concept of spindle cells that you noted, and what they are, and compare us to some other species. So our cousins, the other apes, for example. Um, as an adult ape, they have actually less spindle cells than we do at age 2. We have so many more spindle cells than our ape cousins, chimps and orangutans, gorillas, and so on. And they're pretty social creatures. So these spindle cells are give us the capacity for emotionally relevant interpersonal snap judgments. So they are related to our interpersonal discourse in many ways. So what we know also is they're very vulnerable to not developing because of abuse and neglect. So think of spindle cells as part of our emotional intuition, for example. We're looking at one another's face and we're kind of communicating on multiple levels simultaneously. And those capabilities are not only riding on spindle cells, this capacity that we psychologists call the so-called theory of mind. In my profession, for example, we're constantly looking at our clients or patients, whatever you want to call them, and trying to get a sense of what you're feeling so we can harness the conversation so you could feel better about yourself and your adaptation and all that. So we have to kind of get a sense of what you're feeling, what you're thinking, and all that. Well, those spindle cells snap judgments that give us this intuitive feeling about what's going on. You could say a snap judgment about your emotional state uh, gives us those capacities. Now, I did want to make note that the spindle cells are related to interpersonal kinds of things. There are other parts of so-called snap judgments that uh, are related to this implicit memory system that we were talking about earlier. So a Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman, if you can get an interview with him, it'd be great. He wrote a book that was a bestseller called The Fast and Slow, I forget, Fast and Slow Track or Fast and Slow
Thinking
something.
fast and slow.
Thinking Fast and Slow, right? Exactly. And basically, we was talking about these two broad memory systems and these capacities, and you were bringing up snap judgments. And he and his colleague, um, an Israeli guy whose name I forgot, I apologize for that, looked at investments, and in many ways he won the Nobel Prize because of his research in the economy and everything. So investors make snap judgments too, but sometimes they make snap judgments that are not really that practical in their investments. In other words, I'm going to, snap, uh, make an investment in this particular way, but that's kind of risky. Um, versus the thinking slow is more the accumulation of information over a period of time. So when we first started talking, you asked about working memory, and short-term memory and those other more kind of immediate kinds of capacities have a whole lot more to do with attention. And they're not uh, the same thing, but they're related certainly to long-term memory. So when we're talking, like for example, you're kind of thinking, oh, okay, what am I going to ask next after he after he finishes what he's describing right now? You're using your working memory, and it turns out that we only have the capacity of roughly about 20 to 30 seconds because this area of brain called the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is kind of a fancy way of saying top to the sides up here, that's the last to evolve and last to mature in our brains, roughly until our mid 20s. So our capacity to hold things in mind while we're working and moving around is very, very brief. And you mentioned earlier of another interview that you did with somebody
Dr. Pillai, Dr. Srini Pillai. Yeah.
that wrote the book Dink, Double, Doodle, Try, for example, and he was talking about the default mode network. But I'm also going to add in the capacity for working memory, which is really kind of the reason we can't do too many things multitasking. Why? Because of that capacity. That's why we have this law in most countries not to talk on the cell phone while you're driving, because you're involved in a conversation that isn't right in the car looking ahead, right? There's a limit to how much you can hold in working memory, but not a limit in terms of what you can do with long-term memory. Now, how does that relate to snap judgments? Well, if you're overloaded in your attention and your working memory, your snap judgments aren't going to be that great.
But will you still be able to take the judgments? Because the problem is not whether my judgment is good or bad. The problem is I don't have a judgment. It's like I can't
Yeah,
make a decision.
it really isn't based on a good accumulation of information to make that snap judgment practical. In other words, you can make more mistakes.
Okay. Now that you have touched upon the multitasking, and then we can't do multiple things at the same time. But there are a few people who are very good at doing multitasking, right? I mean, let's talk about Elon Musk managing so many different companies at the same time. Now, there has to be some pattern to how he does multitask across different businesses. And everybody, we are, I think, born being a multitasker because our body is multitasking all the time, right? My heart is right now beating, blood is flowing, everything is happening at the same time when I'm talking to you. And I'm doing many other things consciously also right now, isn't it? So it's a kind of multitask, right? So I think we are wired to do multitask, but it's got a very bad press that it's not
Well,
good.
it depends on what you're doing. You could drive. You could talk to the person that's looking at the same windshield as you. You can talk on the phone, but if you get too much, you can get overloaded. And you mentioned Elon Musk and his capabilities. However, you also know that they're fraying a little bit with sort of a hubrisness. And I would like to suggest that you interview a colleague of many of us over across the Irish Sea over in Dublin, Ian Robinson, who wrote a really good book
Okay.
on the winner effect. In other words, when you receive such acclaim for who you are, you can get a little bit beyond your capabilities and start making some mistakes about how you react to other people. And this issue of multitasking and also prominence in the world is a difficult task that many people have because once you receive so much attention, that you can get kind of beyond your own capabilities and start to say some things that are a little bit abrasive to others and maybe even make some bad decisions. And so his book called The Winner Effect explores some of this and the relationship between the prefrontal cortex and one of the many, many different types of neurotransmitters called dopamine.
Okay. So let's say it is possible to do multitasking, but not two things at the same time. I do agree with that. I mean, you have to do something in time slots, like do something for 1 hour, and maybe after an hour you can change, look into another business, like if you're managing multiple businesses. What is the optimal way to do that? Optimal way to switch between tasks so that you are still efficient on both of the things that you are undertaking. At the same time, you're not overlapping things. So the reason what I want to ask is how you can effectively do multitasking. And when I say multitasking, I don't mean that looking at your phone and driving, not that kind of multitasking, but rather doing one project now and then maybe in the afternoon doing something else and in the evening something else, that kind of multitasking.
Oh, okay. Well, there you're talking about time um, slots, so to speak. And let's even talk about the transition between the time slots, because you just said it's doing something in the morning, doing something in the afternoon, then doing something in the evening. Well, I don't know if I call that multitasking, but we could call it in general what you do during a daytime, and we all do that. We're always, shifting from talking to our family members to going to work to, going out and getting the groceries. I mean, those are usual kinds of experiences that we all have, uh, and they are sort of time slots. However, let's talk about shifting between those time slots on various projects you're working on.
Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned that I like to write and books, and basically the reason I do that is because it structures my learning. So I write about stuff I want to learn more about, so to speak. And boy, that means I really have to really get into it, meaning read a whole lot. And if I don't, I feel malnourished, so to speak. I'm motivated. You see I'm motivated to learn more, which pushes me beyond what I used to know. And especially if I get pushed in an area that I know nothing about, I begin to feel, oh my God, I had no idea how little I knew about this subject, which motivates me to even learn more about it. Now, if I do that throughout the day, uh, if I make the transitions somewhat related, because when I'm writing three different things in three different categories right now. If I can make the transition from the categories somewhat uh, fertile. In other words, if I go from one category to another, but they're somewhat related, I can draw in what I was doing earlier to fertilize, so to speak, the new project. Do you follow what I mean? In
Mm-hmm.
other words, there's more of me there, is what I'm saying. There's more of these implicit memories and these capabilities to bring into the new task. If you can call it a multi, yeah, okay. There's more of me there in that transition that changes to some degree, but it's still somewhat related because I'm not making an abrupt shift and completely doing something new, which is okay. It's just not as fertile.
The other thing that people struggle, in addition to making decision or managing their multiple responsibilities, another thing is they procrastinate a lot, and people don't know why they do it. I do procrastinate on a lot of things, and I sometimes wonder why I'm not doing this particular stuff. So what is going on in between my ears when I'm procrastinating something? Now I can kind of get rid of it and become somebody who's like action taker. Although I am an action taker, but I'm a procrastinator too. So yeah, tell us something to kind of address that.
Well, let's take procrastination as a general category because I do know from our prior conversation before we started taping this that you're a guy who is involved in multiple things and is very curious about a number of things. So I don't know if you're representative of a problem with real procrastination, but let's say a person with real procrastination that really doesn't, is not very productive, isn't very successful in life, and so on. Procrastination is like a form of avoidance. And avoidance in general, and there are many different types of avoidance, avoidance in general create anxiety. So the classic, let's say the most easiest to understand form of avoidance is as soon as we experience something that's anxiety provoking, we just get out of there. You know, like you walk into a room and there's a bunch of strangers and you're anxious about the strangers and you, oh, got to get out of here.
Mm.
That's an avoidance, right? That's an obvious avoidance because you just walk out of there. Another type of avoidance might be delaying going in. You know that you got to go in there, but you keep procrastinating. So there's a layer of avoidance there, but it's a sort of a delay to do something. Well, actually, it's almost like having the brake and the gas pedal on at the same time. So in other words, of procrastination actually makes you less successful. So for procrastinators, who do it because they don't want to be a failure or do a bad job or whatever. Actually, the procrastination actually makes it more likely that you're not going to do a thorough job. Because let's face it, anything that you might do isn't an immediate kind of accomplishment. It's something that you do in layers and you add to it and you add to it and you add. The sooner you get to it, the better job you're going to do. You follow what I mean? So in other words, procrastination is illogical if you think in terms of uh, success. So leaning into it and peeling the layers of the onion away helps you discover really what the project it actually is. So the sooner you get to it, the sooner you're going to understand the full complexity of the project.
I think the problem there is when I am sometime I feel like, I have to finish this thing and I will just finish it because I'm motivated and I've got energy and I just have interest in doing the things that I've been looking at, right? But that doesn't happen always. That happens like for me throughout the day or maybe throughout the week. I have few days which are like super productive, right? I did everything that I did much more than what I was supposed to be doing. But in some days, I just don't do anything, right? So what would you suggest somebody to stay in? It's not possible to always live in the high energy, but in an optimal energy level and optimal motivation, like balanced is a better word, maybe, so that, I can achieve my things and I don't procrastinate on important things at least.
Very, very good that you added the word balance in there. And what you were describing was partly related to your energy level, your motivation, and I was noting earlier the levels of purpose and curiosity are
Mm.
part of the picture here. So let's first talk about energy level because you just finished, let's say, one project over here, and then you might procrastinate about moving over to another project. I'm talking in general terms because it's hard to just focus just on you because we're just meeting one another right now. So I don't absolutely know often how you procrastinate, but in general, a lot of people might procrastinate because it takes a lot of energy to finish one project and then move into another. And then you use the word balance, and I want to kind of cultivate that in our understanding, because you put in a lot of energy into one project and you got this other project over there, and that's why I was talking about inching into it before you kind of cultivate. And there is a balance issue there that we need to address, and partly it relates to subtleties and curiosity again, because there is really a lot of very fascinating research on um, big experiences versus small and subtle experiences. And let's take the real popular now meditative technique that people are always talking about called mindfulness.
Okay.
And all right, and so mindfulness in general, there's many different ways of describing how to be present in a non-judgmental way, and so on, and uh, what we know is that when you're extremely involved in something and you get this incredible aha, that was joyful, that was exhilarating, and just amazing, your brain goes through this process that relates to that involves a number of neurotransmitters, and I mentioned dopamine earlier. It takes a while for the dopamine receptors to recycle if you do these extremes. And let me use a a sport that I'm going to do again this week, and it's skiing because I live very close to a ski place. So I know that some of my friends like to go down the most dangerous bunch of trees, and they're very steep and all that. And it's just you got to go further and faster and everything else. And so a couple of them um, don't find as much enjoyment of going through the more subtle kinds of, still, black diamonds and the advanced and the expert skiing and all that kind of stuff, but doesn't have to be more trees, because the more trees, the more danger, the more extreme and all that. So they lose the appreciation for the subtleness. And so what I'm saying is the motivation to move to another experience, and I'm going to bring in the multitasking discussion as well. If you're more subtle and you're looking at the complexity of the experience, it's easier to make that transition and less likely that you're going to procrastinate. Let me just shine a different angle on this. So with procrastination, if it's going from this to that without a transition of subtleness and noticing with curiosity some of the really, let's say, surprising aspects to the new project, it's harder to make that transition. And so with the balance, bringing that term up again too, you're kind of easing yourself into that next project with a curiosity, but not with the, I got to do it now with intensity, so to speak. You follow what I mean? So in other words, it dissolves the procrastination, because if it's just doing things at the same level, it's harder to make that transition and harder to not procrastinate.
So doing a smooth transition will help.
A smooth transition with curiosity and a paying attention to the subtleness of the next experience. That's why I brought in the mindfulness kind of concept in some ways, because you're not looking at, I got to do this and I got to do that, and that sort of thing. But wow, that's kind of interesting. What does that next project involve? Let me reflect on that a little bit. That helps you make that transition. And there's a lot of neuroscience that helps us understand that. And it's about the recycling of the dopamine receptors. Your brain doesn't have that much time to do that. And if you make the subtleties, your brain can make those dopamine receptors recycle better.
Got it. So now that you've spoken about mindfulness, there is a term which is new to me. I first time heard it, parasympathetic meditation. What is it?
Sympathetic,
Parasympathetic meditation?
parasympathetic meditation. I actually just invented the term. Why? Because so as a young man, like many people, I experienced and tried to cultivate an interest in meditation and sitting around doing yoga and meditation with other people, and going to these different religious areas in different parts of the world, and traveling throughout Asia and the Middle East. And then I was trained in hypnosis and relaxation training and all that. So I'm a guy that likes to synthesize and make sense of and see the complementarity between different practices. So what I do know is that many of these practices, whether, let's say, you're a Muslim, you're going to a mosque, or you're a Christian, you're going to a church, and a yogi, and you're going to an ashram or something, you're still cultivating a part of our autonomic nervous system called the parasympathetic nervous system. In other words, that calms you down and makes you feel more at peace. A lot of meditative techniques, self-hypnosis and relaxation training and prayerful presence, provide that experience. So that's why I came up with parasympathetic yoga or parasympathetic meditation.
All right. Okay. Okay. So John, of course, you're writing a book and you're writing a lot of new stuff, but I was just curious. Can you discuss something exciting, which is a new research or development in the field of brain science that you find particularly interesting?
I think everything's about energy in some ways, because the evolution of all life on this planet had to do with the capacity to harness and organize energy. In other words, let me just kind of go on a little bit about evolution. So roughly about 2 billion years ago on this planet, the only thing really alive was bacteria and fungi and all that. And then one bacteria engulfed another bacteria, and that bacteria that got engulfed later became the energy to create multicellular creatures. Now we call them mitochondria. Let's call them mitos because they're mighty. They provide the energy for everything that we do. So every cell in your body has these mitochondria, again, the mitos, and the high energy consumers in your body, your brain, your heart, your liver, have more mitochondria, hundreds of them. And so everything is about feeding these energy factories so that your brain can function properly and all that. So that relates to diet, because how do these mitos function, these energy factors? You need oxygen and glucose. Glucose comes from the food that you eat. So, and you need to use the energy, which is called ATP. So to remember that, just think all that power. So you need to produce all that power from the mitos. So that relates to the 5 healthy factors, the factors that we've got to practice on a regular basis. The seeds, 5 healthy factors. Diet and exercise are fundamental to brain health. It's fundamental to energy. It's fundamental to your capacity to think. And so we've got to be thinking about energy and how to produce it to be able to have these very vibrant brains. And we know that people whose metabolism is all messed up get dementia earlier and they get depressed earlier.
Okay. I recently interviewed an author, Simon Ong, who's written a book called Energize, which,
Oh, great.
which is brain and energy and all that.
And the book is called Energized. I'll have to take a look at it.
He's in the UK, actually. He's my neighbor. I came to know only after I interviewed him.
Oh, very good. And
And
so send me the link after
other
our talk. Very good.
the link here also. Okay.
Excellent.
So, John, thank you very much. There is one question, John, that I ask all my guests, which is, according to you, what are the top 3 skills that one needs in order to be happy and successful, to have happy and successful life, but schools are not teaching?
Well, I think that it relates to attitude. And let me make reference to the major theologies and a couple of I think, the common denominators among the major theologies. Compassion for other people is both a wonderful social skill, but it's also an antidepressant. Because if you can have compassion for other people and do things for other people without expecting a gain for it, because it's really not compassion and generosity if you're expecting a gain for it,
Yeah.
it's an antidepressant. And it's an attitude that I think we all should have, especially during this time of turmoil on a global level where we're really destroying the planet with climate change. And another one of the major understandings is interdependence. We're all dependent on one another. If we don't work together, we're screwed. And so in the next 20 years with climate change, things are really going to be terrible. I mean, we were talking earlier about India and Pakistan and all that. Look, 1/3 of Pakistan was underwater a couple months ago.
Yeah.
I mean, who was paying attention to that? That's an aspect of climate change. We're interdependent. What we do and how much fuel we use and everything, super, super important. So those 2 aspects, interdependence and compassion, are fundamental. And then you wanted one other one. You wanted 3. And I think curiosity is one of the major let's say, skills that we all want to harness, because we're not going to be able to solve any problems without a sense of curiosity about how to solve them. And it's rather interesting, I think, just to explore all of that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for sharing. I'm just collecting this answer, and I've got almost 75 answers from different people I've interviewed. Curiosity and compassion and empathy are public speaking are some of the top skills that people think that should be taught in schools.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you very much for sharing that. So finally, John, if people want to know more about your work, how can they reach you?
Well, probably the easiest way is, for most people, that is just to go to my website, because you can send me an email from my website. So it's basically just drjohnarden.com, DrJohnArden, with no spaces between the letters, DrJohnArden.com. And I do respond to emails. I always feel that it's I don't know who's emailing me, but I respond to an email, at least acknowledging that you emailed me. And if I'm busy, I'll say I'll get to you later, so to speak. So when I send somebody an email, I expect the same thing. So you have to practice what you preach.
Thank you very much. And I agree that you do respond to emails. Thank you very much for coming here on this show. I really learned a lot by reading your book and talking to you. And then I'm hoping to read the new book that is coming up, and maybe we can talk again about the new model, which is seeds. I've I've watched it from some of your interviews about the new book, so we can talk about seeds later. Again, you touched upon them in this one also a little bit. But so overall, thank you very much, John. Thanks a lot for your time.
Oh, it's great to talk to you, and I wish you the best.
Thank you. Guys, if you want to know more about what work John has done, go check out his website. I'll put all of the links that he discussed. Now he's written 16 books about your brain. So once you've read John's books, I'm sure if you give attention to all the technical terms that he's using, the kind of default mode network or parasynthetic, and I don't know, I don't even recall those names. You will almost become a good professional psychologist just by reading John's books. Right. Do check it out, and it's life changing because John brings some of the case studies with his patients or his clients rather, and they tell them a situation, and then he tells you how he addressed those situations. So it's really really worth. This book is the one that I'm talking about is 13 years old, but in the new one maybe we'll have some more case studies which are more relevant to today's world, wherein we live in a such attention deficit sort of society.
Mhm.
So maybe we'll see again. So thank you very much for your time and attention till here. I will come back again next week. Until then, you take care and keep learning. And by the way, if you've not yet done so and you've got some value from this interview, then do not forget to subscribe to this channel. I'll see you again. Until then, keep learning and take care. Goodbye.